In the misty dawn of Port Harbor, where salt-worn docks creak beneath weathered boots, a storm is brewing that has nothing to do with the weather. When a notorious biker gang rolls into this peaceful fishing town, they see only what the locals see. An aging fisherman who spends his days alone on the pier, his calloused hands mending nets, and his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. They mistake his silence for weakness, his solitude for vulnerability. It's the last mistake they'll ever make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen isn't just another fisherman. For 25 years, he was the Navy's most elite phantom, a SEAL team commander whose missions were so classified, even the Pentagon kept them under lock and key. His call sign was Tide, because, like the ocean itself, he could sweep in silently and leave nothing but devastation in his wake. This isn't just another tale of petty harassment gone wrong. This is the story of how a gang of thugs on motorcycles learned that some waters run deeper than others, and some predators never lose their bite. When they decided to make an example of the quiet man on the docks, they didn't realize they were challenging someone who had turned entire war zones into hunting grounds. What follows is the account of how one former SEAL would remind these bikers that whether on land or at sea, they're playing in his element, and in these waters there's always a bigger fish. The salty breeze carried the first light of dawn across Port Harbor's weathered docks, bringing with it the familiar symphony of creaking wood and gentle waves. Marcus Chen's footsteps fell in rhythm with these sounds as he made his way down Pier 7, his trusted spot for the past 5 years. Each morning, he arrived before the sun, carrying the weight of his fishing gear and heavier memories. His calloused hands moved automatically through the ritual of preparing his equipment. Muscle memory developed not from his years as a fisherman, but from decades of maintaining military gear. The methodical nature of the work kept his mind focused, preventing it from drifting to memories of Maria. Still, on mornings like this, when the fog rolled thick across the water, he could almost see her standing at their kitchen window, steam rising from her coffee cup as she watched the harbor come alive. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon drifted across the dock, pulling Marcus from his reverie. Sarah's diner had opened its doors, right on schedule. The petite woman with graying hair tied back in a neat bun stood in the doorway, raising her hand in greeting. She was one of the few people in Port Harbor who had managed to crack through his self-imposed isolation. "Same as usual, Marcus," Sarah called out, though she already knew the answer. For 5 years, it had been black coffee and 2 eggs over easy, served precisely at 6:15 a.m. He nodded, allowing himself a slight smile. Sarah reminded him of the combat nurses he'd known, tough as nails beneath a gentle exterior. She'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years ago, but kept the diner running with unwavering determination. In her own way, she was as much a warrior as any SEAL he'd served with. The peaceful morning routine shattered as the distant roar of motorcycles echoed across the water. Marcus's hand instinctively tightened around his coffee cup, old instincts rising to the surface. He'd noticed them yesterday. A dozen bikes rolling into town, their riders wearing patches that marked them as the Coastal Reapers. His trained eye had caught the bulges of concealed weapons beneath their leather jackets, the way they scanned buildings for security cameras, the practiced formation of their riding pattern. "Trouble's brewing," Sarah muttered, following his gaze to the main street. "They were in here last night, making noise, scaring customers. Tommy says they've been asking questions about the port security schedules." Tommy. The kid was another reason Marcus couldn't simply ignore the brewing storm. 17 years old, working the docks to help his single mother, Tommy had become something of an unofficial apprentice to Marcus. He reminded him too much of his own son would have been had the pregnancy not ended with the accident that took Maria. The morning light caught something metallic moving through the fog, a small fishing boat approaching the pier. Marcus recognized Tommy's slight frame at the helm, the boy expertly guiding the vessel despite the poor visibility. The kid had natural talent, the kind that came from growing up on the water. They tried recruiting some of the younger dock workers yesterday, Sarah continued, her voice tight with concern. Tommy told them to shove off, but, well, you know how these types operate. They don't take no for an answer. Marcus did know. He'd seen it countless times in ports across the world. Criminal organizations moving in, starting small, with local intimidation, before escalating to full control of shipping routes. It was a pattern he'd disrupted many times during his career, though always with a team at his back and the full authority of the U.S. Navy supporting his actions. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, and Marcus watched as Tommy's boat bumped against the pier. The boy's movements were hurried as he tied off, his eyes darting toward the street. There was fear there, but also determination, the look of someone too proud to back down, but smart enough to know they're in over their head. Marcus finished his coffee, setting the cup down with deliberate care. 5 years ago, he'd chosen this port specifically because it was quiet, peaceful, far from the violence that had defined his life. He'd promised Maria, in those final moments as she slipped away, that he would find a way to live without war. But as he watched Tommy scramble onto the pier, as he noted Sarah's worried glance toward the approaching bikers, Marcus felt the familiar clarity settling over his mind. Sometimes peace wasn't a choice you could make alone. Sometimes maintaining peace meant being ready to wage war. The fog was beginning to lift now, revealing the first hints of what promised to be a clear, sunny day. But Marcus knew better. He could feel it in his bones, in the battle-hardened instincts that had kept him alive through decades of combat. A storm was coming to Port Harbor. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Port Harbor as Marcus worked on his nets, his methodical movements masking his hyper-awareness of his surroundings. The memory of his last mission surfaced with each pull of cord through weathered hands. Caracas, 2018, the operation that ended everything. His team had been tracking a weapons trafficking ring, one that had been supplying cartels across South America. The intel was solid. The plan was perfect, but something had gone wrong. Someone had known they were coming. The ambush had cost him 4 men, 4 brothers, and left him with a choice no commander should have to make. "Mr. Chen?" Tommy's voice pulled him from the dark memories. The boy stood at the edge of the pier, holding a tangled mass of fishing line. "Could you show me that knot again, the one for joining broken lines?" Marcus nodded, grateful for the interruption. Tommy had a natural talent for the work, but more importantly, he had the patience to learn properly, unlike the other teenage dock workers who saw the job as merely a paycheck. Tommy understood the rhythm of the port, the importance of doing things right. "Here," Marcus demonstrated, his hands moving with practiced precision. "The line needs to flow like water. Force it, and it breaks. Work with it." The knot came together perfectly. "And it holds against any storm." "Like in the SEALs?" Tommy asked hesitantly. It was the first time the boy had directly referenced Marcus's past. "Dad used to talk about you guys before he shipped out for his last tour in Afghanistan." Marcus studied Tommy's face, seeing the mixture of pride and pain. The boy's father, a Marine, had died 3 years ago. Another good man lost to endless war. "Your father was a brave man, Tommy. He understood duty." "The bikers were asking about you," Tommy said suddenly, his voice dropping. "At the fuel dock. They knew things about your service, about what happened in Venezuela." Marcus's hands stilled. Very few people knew the details of that mission. Even fewer knew about its connection to Venezuela. He'd chosen Port Harbor specifically because it was off the grid, away from anyone who might recognize his name or face. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Marcus. Police Chief Robert Hayes approached, his casual stride belying the tension. In his shoulders, Robert was one of the few who knew Marcus's full story. They'd served together in the Rangers before Robert joined law enforcement and Marcus moved to special operations. They're not just any gang, Robert said quietly, positioning himself so his back was to the security cameras. Got the intel this morning. The Coastal Reapers are connected to the Cortez cartel. The same people who... I know, Marcus cut him off, not wanting to revisit those memories. The Cortez cartel had been behind the weapons in Caracas. They were the ones who had turned his final mission into a trap, who had forced him to watch his team die before fighting his way out through sheer will and decades of training. There's more, Robert continued. Local business owners are reporting shakedowns. Sarah's been threatened. They're moving faster than typical cartel operations, like they've got a deadline. Marcus watched as Tommy pretended to work on his lines while straining to hear their conversation. The boy reminded him of Johnson, the youngest member of his SEAL team. Same eager eyes, same quiet determination. Johnson had died in his arms in Caracas, bleeding out while whispering about the girl he'd planned to marry. I can't officially do anything, Robert said, frustration evident in his voice. They've got connections in the state government. Any move I make gets shut down before it starts, but if something were to happen, unofficially... I retired, Marcus stated flatly, though his mind was already cataloguing the harbor's vulnerabilities. Identifying potential choke points, planning contingencies. Old habits died hard, did you? Robert asked quietly. Because the man I knew, the one they called Tide, he wouldn't stand by while innocents were threatened. He wouldn't let scum like this destroy a community. A burst of laughter drew their attention to the far end of the pier. 3 bikers were surrounding a local fisherman, making a show of examining his boat. Their leader, a heavily tattooed man with a scarred face, caught Marcus watching and smiled coldly. They're planning something big, Robert continued. Using the port as a distribution hub, maybe worse. And they're not subtle about it because they think we're helpless, just a bunch of simple fishermen and shopkeepers. Marcus thought of Sarah, of how she'd welcomed him without questions when he first arrived, broken and haunted. He thought of Tommy, carrying his father's memory while trying to build a future. He thought of his team in Caracas, of promises made to dying brothers. I made a promise, Marcus said finally, his voice distant, to stop being the weapon, to find peace. Sometimes, Robert replied, resting a hand briefly on his old friend's shoulder, peace needs to be defended, and sometimes the best defenders are the ones who understand the true cost of violence. As Robert walked away, Marcus returned to his nets, his movements now unconsciously matching the rhythm he'd used thousands of times while maintaining his weapons. The muscle memory was still there, lying dormant beneath years of self-imposed exile. Like the tide itself, it could only be held back for so long. Tommy worked silently beside him, but Marcus could feel the boy's sideways glances. The young man had lost his father to war, and now he was watching another man wrestle with its lingering shadows. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He'd come to Port Harbor to escape violence, only to find himself being pulled back into its undertow. Afternoon light caught the chrome of motorcycles lined up outside Sarah's diner. Through the window, Marcus could see the bikers lounging at the counter, their presence causing visible discomfort among the regular customers. Sarah served them with her usual efficiency, but Marcus recognized the tension in her movements, the more careful way she kept her distance. His hands continued their work with the nets, but his mind was elsewhere, in dark waters where predators lurked, in shadows where violence waited with familiar patience. He'd spent 25 years as one of America's most lethal operators, and though he'd tried to leave that life behind, he knew some skills never faded, some instincts never died. The sun was setting now, painting the harbor in shades of blood. and gold. A storm was coming to Port Harbor, and Chen was beginning to accept that he might be the only one who could weather it. The confrontation Marcus had been anticipating arrived 3 days later, carried in on the rumble of motorcycle engines and the acrid stench of burning rubber. He was working on his boat's engine when the first bike rolled onto the pier, followed by 5 others. Their engines echoed off the water, sending seabirds scattering into the morning sky. Drake Harrison, the gang's leader, dismounted first. Even without Robert's intelligence briefing, Marcus would have marked him as the alpha. The man moved with the calculated swagger of someone used to violence, his scarred face and cold eyes speaking of battles won through brutality rather than skill. 2 teardrops tattooed beneath his left eye suggested prison time, while the fresh ink on his neck, a coiled snake ready to strike, marked his recent allegiance to the Cortez cartel. "Nice morning for fishing," Drake called out, his boot heels striking the wooden planks with deliberate force. "Though I hear the waters around here can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." Marcus continued working on his engine, his movements unhurried. He tracked the other bikers through his peripheral vision, 5 men spreading out in a practiced formation. 2 carried concealed pistols, 1 had a knife in his boot, and the largest one gripped a length of chain wrapped around his meaty fist. "You know what I find interesting?" Drake continued, stopping a few feet from Marcus's boat. "How a decorated SEAL commander ends up in this shithole playing fisherman, especially after what went down in Caracas." That made Marcus pause. If only for a fraction of a second. The Caracas operation was classified, the kind of information that shouldn't be in the hands of a cartel enforcer. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, buying time to assess the situation. "I'm retired," Marcus stated flatly, though his mind was already mapping escape routes, calculating angles, identifying potential weapons within reach. The wrench in his back pocket, the boat hook hanging on the gunwale, the fishing gaff secured to the cabin wall. Drake's laugh held no humor. "Retired? Is that what you tell yourself?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Because the way I heard it, you retired after watching your whole team die, after one of your own turned out to be working for—" The sound of running feet interrupted him. Tommy burst onto the pier, out of breath. "Mr. Chen, they're trashing your gear shed. The other bikers there—" The boy skidded to a stop as he registered the scene before him. "Perfect timing, kid," Drake smiled, revealing gold-capped teeth. "We were just discussing business with your mentor here." He nodded to one of his men, who moved to block Tommy's retreat. Marcus felt the familiar combat clarity settling over him, time seeming to slow as his body prepared for violence. "The boy has nothing to do with this. Everyone has something to do with this," Drake countered. "See, this port? It belongs to the Reapers now, and people need to understand what that means." He snapped his fingers, and the man with the chain stepped forward, advancing on Tommy. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for those watching. But for Marcus, it was a blur of practiced efficiency. As the chain-wielding biker reached for Tommy, Marcus moved. The wrench left his back pocket and found the biker's wrist with surgical precision, shattering bone. Before the man's scream could reach full volume, Marcus had already pivoted, using the biker's momentum to send him crashing into his colleague. The third biker managed to clear his pistol from his waistband, but Marcus was already inside his guard. A strike to the throat, an elbow to the solar plexus, and a knee to the temple ended that threat. The fourth attacker's knife slashed through empty air as Marcus flowed around the attack like water around a rock, redirecting the blade into its owner's thigh. In less than 10 seconds, 4 of Drake's men lay groaning or unconscious on the pier. The 5th backed away, fumbling for his weapon, but Drake's voice stopped him. "Enough!" Marcus positioned himself between Tommy and the remaining bikers, his breathing steady, his stance relaxed but ready. The violence had awakened something in him, not bloodlust, but a cold professional focus he hadn't accessed in years. You just made a serious mistake, Drake snarled, though he remained carefully out of reach. You have no idea what's coming. I know exactly what's coming, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded men in combat. You're going to take your people and leave this port. Today. Drake's laugh was ugly. Or what? You'll kill us all? That's not your style anymore, is it? The legendary Tide, now just an old man playing with boats. He backed away, gesturing for his conscious men to help their fallen comrades. But since you want to play rough, the distant sound of breaking glass and screaming drifted across the water. Smoke began rising from the direction of Sarah's diner. That's just the beginning, Drake promised as he mounted his bike. By the time we're done, you'll wish you'd stayed out of it, just like in Caracas. The bikes roared to life, carrying their riders away as sirens began wailing in the distance. Tommy was shaking, whether from fear or adrenaline. Marcus couldn't tell. Mr. Chen, those moves, you... Go help Sarah, Marcus cut him off, his voice carrying the snap of command. As the boy ran toward the smoke, Marcus surveyed the aftermath of the brief combat. Blood stained the pier's weathered boards, and the morning air carried the lingering scent of cordite and fear. He had hoped to avoid this, had promised Maria he would find a way to live without violence. But as he watched smoke rising from Sarah's diner, as he recalled Drake's words about Caracas, Marcus knew he had run out of options. The tide was rising, and with it came the familiar pull of war. Port Harbor had become a battlefield, and battlefields were where Marcus Chen felt most at home. Night fell over Port Harbor like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a fog that crept between the buildings and wrapped around the streetlights. From his vantage point on the roof of the old cannery, Marcus watched the bikers' headquarters through. His weathered binoculars, tools of his past life that he'd never quite managed to discard. The coastal reapers had taken over the abandoned fish processing plant at the north end of the harbor. Their security was professional. Rotating patrols, overlapping fields of view, communications equipment that suggested military training. This wasn't just some random gang. These were organized criminals with serious backing. You shouldn't be. Up here? Robert's voice came from behind him, barely above a whisper. The police chief moved quietly for a big man, another remnant of his ranger days. Drake's got friends in high places. They're watching me, watching you. Marcus lowered the binoculars but didn't turn around. They're running something through. The processing plant. Regular deliveries, heavy security, specialized equipment being moved in at night. Drug lab, Robert confirmed, crouching beside him. But that's not the half of it. Got word from my FBI contact. The Cortez cartel is planning something big. They're setting up distribution hubs all along the coast, but Port Harbor's different. This is their command center. A motorcycle roared past on the street below, the rider wearing the Reaper's colors. Through his binoculars, Marcus counted the fourth such patrol in the last hour. They were marking their territory, showing the town who owned the night. Sarah's diner? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Insurance won't cover it. They're calling it an electrical fire, but we both know better. Robert's voice carried the frustration of a man bound by laws that his enemies ignored. She's not the only one. 3 other businesses hit in the last 2 days. They're sending a message. Marcus thought of Sarah's face when he'd helped her salvage what she could from the diner's ruins. The strength there, the refusal to break, even as everything she'd built went up in smoke. They're escalating too fast. Cartels usually take their time, establish themselves gradually. This is different. Because of you, Robert said bluntly. Drake's got a hard-on for making you suffer. This isn't just business for him, it's personal. A figure moved through the fog below, Tommy, making his way home after helping Sarah secure what remained of her diner. The boy had shown remarkable courage these past few days, refusing to be cowed by the bikers' intimidation. The kid shouldn't be out alone, Robert noted. Not with them patrolling. Marcus was already moving, packing away his surveillance gear with practiced efficiency. "Walk with him. Make it obvious he's under police protection. And you, I need to see something." Marcus melted into the shadows, his movements fluid and purposeful. The fisherman's gait was gone, replaced by the deadly grace of a predator. He made his way through the harbor's back alleys, staying in the blind spots of the gang's patrol routes. Their security was good, but Marcus had spent decades learning how to be invisible in far more dangerous environments. The fog helped, providing natural concealment as he worked his way closer to the processing plant. The loading dock told him what he needed to know. Fresh tire marks from heavy trucks, sophisticated electronic locks on the new doors, and the faint chemical smell that suggested more than just drug production. They were manufacturing something else, something that required industrial equipment and precise temperature control. A burst of radio chatter caught his attention, two guards speaking in rapid Spanish about a shipment arriving tomorrow night. Marcus's language skills were rusty, but he caught enough to know this wasn't a routine delivery. "Figured I'd find you skulking around," a voice said from the shadows. Marcus turned to find Tommy, who had somehow slipped away from Robert's escort. The boy's eyes were bright with a mixture of fear and determination. "You shouldn't be here," Marcus growled, though his tone lacked real anger. The kid reminded him too much of himself at that age, too brave for his own good. "They killed my dad," Tommy said quietly. "The cartel. That's what really happened in Afghanistan. He was investigating their opium operations, and they made it look like a Taliban attack. I found his letters after letters he wrote to the military investigators." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The pieces were starting to fit together. Drake's knowledge of Caracas, the cartel's sudden interest in Port Harbor, Tommy's father's death. This wasn't just about territory or drug distribution. This was about tying up loose ends. "I can help," Tommy insisted. "I know every inch of this harbor, every hiding spot, every—" "No." Marcus's voice carried the weight of command. "You help by staying alive, by protecting Sarah and the others, by being smarter than I was." The sound of approaching motorcycles cut through the fog. Marcus guided Tommy into a narrow space, between containers, shielding him as headlights swept past. The boy's breathing was steady, controlled, the breathing of someone who had learned early how to handle fear. "Tomorrow night," Marcus said once the bikes had passed. "Whatever they're bringing in, it's important. Important enough to change their patrol patterns. Important enough to risk exposure." "What are you going to do?" Marcus thought of Sarah's ruined diner, of Tommy's father dying in a foreign land, of his own team bleeding out in Caracas. He thought of the promise he'd made to Maria about finding peace. But sometimes, he realized, peace had to be built on the foundation of necessary violence. "I'm going to do what I should have done from the start," he said quietly. "I'm going to hunt." Dawn painted Port Harbor in shades of steel grey as Marcus watched the coastal reapers implement their takeover. Like a cancer spreading through healthy tissue, they moved methodically through the port's vital areas. Armed men in leather jackets positioned themselves at key checkpoints: the fuel dock, the main pier, the harbour master's office. Their message was clear: nothing moved in or out of Port Harbor without their permission. From his position in the shadow of a storage container, Marcus observed their operation with professional assessment. They had the numbers, at least 30 men now, with more arriving daily. Their weapons were military-grade, visible enough to intimidate, but concealed enough to maintain deniability. These weren't common thugs. This was a trained paramilitary force hiding behind a biker gang's patches. "They're checking every boat now," a quiet voice said behind him. Tommy appeared like a ghost, moving with the natural stealth of someone who'd grown up exploring every hidden corner of the harbor. "Won't let anyone leave without inspection. 3 fishing crews already quit, rather than deal with them." Marcus nodded, noting how the gang's checkpoints created overlapping fields of control. "They're establishing a secure perimeter. Standard cartel technique, Control all access points before starting major operations. The sound of breaking glass drew their attention to the harbourmaster's office. Two bikers were escorting the old harbourmaster out, their grips tight on his arms, as a third carried out boxes of documents. The old man's face was bloody, his decades of authority stripped away in moments of violence. They'll replace him with their own man, Marcus explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Someone who'll doctor the shipping manifests, look the other way when certain cargo moves through. A commotion erupted near the main pier. A group of local fishermen, led by Chen, no relation to Marcus, was confronting the bikers over the new inspection fees. Marcus recognized the dangerous tension in the air, the moment when intimidation could easily escalate to bloodshed. The confrontation ended predictably. Mike, a veteran fisherman who'd worked these waters for 30 years, took a chain to the knee. As he crumpled, screaming, the message to other boat owners became crystal clear: resist and suffer. "We have to do something," Tommy whispered, his hands clenched into fists. "They're destroying everything." Before Marcus could respond, 3 more bikes roared into the harbour area. Drake led the formation, his scarred face visible even at this distance. They pulled up to the processing plant, where workers were unloading crates from an unmarked truck. Through his binoculars, Marcus caught glimpses of sophisticated laboratory equipment. "Not just drugs," he murmured, years of experience helping him piece together the puzzle. "They're setting up something bigger. The chemical smells, the industrial equipment, the level of security." His blood ran cold as realization dawned. They're creating a weapons lab. Tommy's sharp intake of breath showed he understood the implications. "Like what they used in Caracas, what they used to kill your team." Marcus's hand tightened on the binoculars. The ambush that had killed his men hadn't just involved conventional weapons. The cartel had used something new, a chemical agent that had turned the mission into a nightmare of choking death and desperate last stands. A motorcycle engine revved nearby, and Marcus pulled Tommy deeper into the shadows. 2 reapers rode past, escorting a bleeding dock worker toward the port exit. The man clutched his ribs, his face a mask of pain and defeat. "That's Carlos," Tommy said, his voice shaking with anger. "He refused to help them unload their special. A cargo last night. Said he had kids, couldn't risk getting involved in anything illegal." Marcus watched the scene with cold calculation. The gang was moving faster now, their facade of legitimate business dropping away as they consolidated control. Soon, they'd have the entire port locked down, a perfect base for whatever operation the cartel was planning. The morning fog began to lift, revealing more bikes arriving, more armed men taking positions throughout the harbour. Like a noose tightening, their control was becoming absolute. Most of the legitimate businesses would be gone within days, replaced by cartel fronts or simply shut down. A police cruiser rolled slowly past the processing plant. Not Roberts. This was one of the newer officers, carefully looking the other way as boxes were unloaded. The corruption was spreading, just as Marcus had seen in ports across South America. "They beat up Tommy!" Sarah's voice carried across the water, drawing Marcus's attention to her temporary food stand. She'd set it up after her diner burned, refusing to let the gang drive her out of business. Now she stood toe-to-toe with one of Drake's lieutenants, her face flushed with anger. "He's just a kid, you animals." Marcus turned sharply to Tommy, noting for the first time the bruises the boy had tried to hide, the way he favored his left side. "When?" "Last night," Tommy admitted. "They caught me watching their unloading operation. Said next time they'd do worse." The cold professional calculation in Marcus's mind shifted, becoming something darker, more personal. He'd watched his team die in Caracas because he'd followed rules of engagement, had tried to maintain operational parameters against an enemy that recognized no limits. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. "Go home," he told Tommy, his voice carrying the tone of absolute command. "Stay there until I contact you." "But I can help." "You help by staying alive." Marcus cut him off. "What's coming? It's not for you to see." As Tommy reluctantly slipped away, Marcus began his own withdrawal, moving through the harbor's shadows with lethal purpose. The fisherman's disguise was falling away, revealing the predator beneath. The gang had made their move, establishing their dominance over the port. Now it was his turn to hunt. The night port harbor, changed forever, started with a scream. Marcus was doing his evening equipment check when he heard it. A sound of pure terror that cut through the foggy darkness like a knife. His body was moving before his mind could process, muscle memory from years of combat taking over as he sprinted towards Sarah's temporary food stand. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. Sarah's stand was engulfed in flames, the fire reflecting off the water in hellish waves. Drake stood with 5 of his men, watching the destruction with casual satisfaction. But it was Sarah's position that made Marcus's combat-hardened heart skip a beat. 2 bikers held her at the edge of the pier, her feet dangling over the dark water. "Quite a show, isn't it?" Drake called out, noticing Marcus's approach. "Sarah here needed a lesson. In respect. Seems running a food stand after we burned down her diner was a bit defiant." Marcus moved with measured steps, his mind calculating angles, distances, threats. The 2 men holding Sarah were his primary concern. At this temperature, the harbor water could induce hypothermia in minutes. 3 more bikers stood with hands near concealed weapons, while Drake remained slightly apart, watching with predatory amusement. "Let her go," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded elite warriors. Drake's laugh was ugly. Poor choice of words, considering her position, but that's what this is all about, isn't it? Choices. He moved closer to Sarah, who struggled against her captors with desperate strength. "See, everyone in this port has a choice, submit or suffer. Your friend here chose poorly." "I caught them," Sarah spat, her voice shaking but defiant. "Putting something in people's food, some kind of drug, testing it like we were lab rats." Marcus's jaw tightened. Chemical weapons testing on uninformed civilians. It fit the cartel's pattern. This isn't about Sarah. It's about Caracas, about what happened there. "Smart man," Drake smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "You know, your team wasn't supposed to die that night. They were supposed to suffer, to serve as examples. But you ruined that plan, killed our best chemist before we could perfect the formula." The pieces clicked into place, the lab equipment, the security, the rushed timeline. They weren't just manufacturing weapons. They were perfecting them, using Port Harbor's isolated population as test subjects. "Times have changed," Drake continued. "We've got better chemists now, better facilities, and you get to watch as we turn your precious harbor into our testing ground." He nodded to the men holding Sarah. "Show him what happens to people who resist." Everything happened in a heartbeat. The bikers moved to throw Sarah, but Marcus was already in motion. Years of training, countless missions, and pure survival instinct culminated in a burst of lethal efficiency. His first strike crushed a throat, the second shattered a knee. Sarah dropped to the pier as her captors fell, rolling away from the edge with surprising agility. The remaining bikers reached for weapons, but they were too slow, too untrained for this level of violence. Marcus moved like water, flowing between them with terrible purpose. Bones broke, bodies fell, and in seconds only Drake remained standing, his face twisted with rage and something else, fear. "This changes nothing," Drake snarled, backing away. "The port is ours. The testing continues, and next time—" He glanced at Sarah, who was being helped up by Tommy. The boy had appeared from nowhere, as usual. "Next time we won't be so gentle." As Drake retreated into the darkness, Marcus knelt by Sarah. "Are you hurt?" Just my pride, she managed, though her voice trembled, and my business again. She looked at the burning remains of her food stand, years of work reduced to ashes for the second time. Tommy helped her sit on a nearby bollard. We'll rebuild. We always do. No, Marcus said quietly, watching Drake's motorcycle disappear into the fog. No more rebuilding, no more hiding. He turned to Sarah, his expression set with deadly determination. I'm sorry. I tried to stay out of it, tried to keep my promise to find peace, but some wars find you, no matter how far you run. Robert arrived with his patrol car, lights flashing but sirens silent. He took in the scene, the burning stand, the fallen bikers, the look in Marcus's eyes. You know this means war. It already was war, Marcus replied, helping Sarah to her feet. They just didn't know they were fighting a seal. As if to punctuate his words, an explosion rocked the harbor. In the distance, more of Drake's men were sending a message, destroying the last vestiges of resistance. Flames reflected off the water like hungry spirits, and screams echoed across the port. Marcus watched it all with the cold calculation of a warrior preparing for battle. He had tried to live as a fisherman, had tried to honor Maria's wish for him to find peace. But as he looked at Sarah's haunted eyes, as he saw the bruises on Tommy's face and the fear in the harbor's residents, he knew there was only one path forward. Get everyone to safety, he told Robert. When this starts, it's going to get ugly. When what starts? Tommy asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was already cataloguing resources, planning attacks, falling back into the mindset that had made him a legend in the SEAL teams. Drake thought he was dealing with a broken-down veteran playing at peace. He was about to learn why Marcus's call sign had been Tide, because like the tide itself, his retribution was inevitable, unstoppable, and absolutely merciless. The hunt, he said finally, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had found his true purpose again. And this time, I'm not stopping until the harbor is clear. The night air carried the smell of smoke and fear, but beneath it, another scent was rising, the sharp metallic tang of coming violence, the war for Port E. Harbor was about to begin, and Marcus Chen was finally ready to embrace the warrior he had tried so hard to leave behind. The first biker disappeared 2 days after Sarah's stand burned down. He was on a routine patrol of the harbor's north end when his radio went silent. By morning, his motorcycle was found perfectly parked at the pier's edge, its engine cold. The only trace of the rider was his leather jacket, laid out flat on the dock, the coastal reaper's patch removed with surgical precision. Drake sent 4 men to investigate. Only 3 returned, the 4th vanishing between one security checkpoint and the next. His bike was found in the same spot as the first, jacket laid out in identical fashion. The remaining 3 swore they'd seen shadows moving in impossible ways, heard whispers in the fog that shouldn't have been there. Getting sloppy, Marcus, Robert said quietly, watching from his patrol car as gang members conducted an increasingly frantic search of the harbor. They found blood on the second jacket. Marcus continued repairing his fishing nets, his movements methodical and unhurried. They were meant to. Fear's more effective when there's evidence. The police chief studied his old friend's face, recognizing the calculated precision he remembered from their service days. The weapons lab? Heavily guarded, but not their primary concern anymore. Marcus tested the strength of a knot. They're spending more resources looking for ghosts than protecting their operation. Classic misdirection. A commotion erupted near the processing plant as another search party returned empty-handed. Drake's voice carried across the water, promising violence to anyone who failed to maintain their posts. His control was slipping. Everyone could see it. 3 more tried to quit this morning, Robert reported. Drake shot one in the leg as an example to the others. He's getting desperate, making mistakes. Marcus nodded, having anticipated this reaction. Psychological warfare wasn't just about creating fear. It was about forcing the enemy to reveal weaknesses, to abandon careful plans in favor of emotional responses. He'd learned these lessons in 100 battles across the globe, but never had he applied them with such personal satisfaction. The fog rolled in early that evening, thick and impenetrable, perfect conditions for hunting. Marcus moved through the darkness like a ghost, decades of training allowing him to slip between security patrols with fluid grace. The guards were bunching up now, too afraid to patrol alone, creating gaps in their coverage. Near midnight, he found his opportunity. 2 bikers, both newer recruits judging by their nervous movements, separated slightly from their group to share a cigarette. Their weapons were holstered, their attention focused on the shadows around them rather than the threat above. Marcus descended from the warehouse roof in perfect silence. The first biker had no time to scream before unconsciousness claimed him. The second managed to reach for his radio, but Marcus's hand strike to the throat cut off any alarm. Both men would wake up hours later, stripped of their gang colors, their bodies arranged carefully near their bikes, as a message. "You're enjoying this," Tommy's voice came from nearby as Marcus finished positioning the jackets. The boy had gotten better at moving quietly, though he'd never managed to truly surprise the veteran SEAL. "Not enjoying," Marcus corrected, his voice carrying the cold precision of a surgeon. "Calculating. Each disappearance feeds their fear. Fear makes them sloppy. Sloppy makes them vulnerable." A burst of gunfire echoed across the harbor, another patrol shooting at shadows. They were burning through ammunition now, jumping at every noise. Soon they'd have to radio for resupply, and that call would tell Marcus exactly when the next shipment was due. "Drake's bringing in more men," Tommy reported, showing off his growing skills at reconnaissance. "But the older ones, the ones who've seen 3 disappear, they're talking about leaving." Marcus processed this information with professional detachment. "They'll try to break me first, make an example, go after someone I care about." "Like Sarah?" Tommy's voice carried a tremor of concern. "Sarah's safe. Robert has her in a safe house outside town." Marcus began his silent withdrawal from the area, Tommy following like a shadow. "But they'll try something dramatic, something public." As if on cue, an explosion lit up the night sky. One of the local fishing boats erupted in flames, its fuel tank transformed into an improvised bomb. The message was clear: for every biker that disappeared, the town would suffer. "We have to stop them," Tommy insisted, his young face illuminated. "By the burning boat." "We already are," Marcus replied, watching as panic spread through the gang's ranks. 3 more bikers had just abandoned their posts to respond to the explosion, leaving another gap in their security. "They think this display of force makes them stronger. Instead, it makes them predictable." A voice crackled over a stolen radio, Drake ordering all hands to help contain the fire, leaving the weapons lab minimally defended, exactly as Marcus had planned. "Go home, Tommy," he ordered, checking his watch. "What happens next isn't for you to see." But the boy lingered, his eyes reflecting the flames. "My dad, before he died, he said sometimes good men have to do bad things to stop evil." Marcus paused, hearing the echo of his own lost innocence in Tommy's words. "Your father was right, but the trick is remembering what you're fighting for. Not revenge, protection." He gestured to the burning boat, to the frightened town beyond. "Everything I do, every shadow I create, every fear I instill, it's all to protect this harbor. Remember that." As Tommy melted away into the darkness, Marcus began his own careful movement toward the weapons lab. The gang's fear had created an opportunity, and he hadn't survived this long by hesitating when opportunities arose. The fog thickened, carrying the smell of smoke and fear across the water. Somewhere in the chaos, another biker would vanish tonight, another jacket would be laid out as a warning. The coastal reapers were learning what every enemy Marcus had ever faced eventually discovered. In the realm of shadow warfare, Reputation was a weapon sharper than any blade, and Marcus Chen's reputation was just beginning to draw blood. Port Harbor's maze of shipping containers became Marcus's killing ground. He moved between the steel canyons like a shark through dark waters, using decades of combat experience to turn the industrial landscape into a weapon. Each container created shadows, each corner offered ambush points, and every elevated position became a sniper's nest, though Marcus preferred closer, quieter methods of elimination. "They're rotating shifts every 4 hours now," Tommy whispered from his hiding spot behind a stack of crates. The boy had proven invaluable, his intimate knowledge of the port's layout matching Marcus's tactical expertise. Nobody walks alone anymore, always groups of 3 or more. Marcus watched a patrol pass below their position, noting their tensed shoulders and nervous trigger fingers. "They're burning out. Sleep deprivation, constant stress, jumping at shadows, makes them dangerous, but sloppy." The past week had transformed the port into a pressure cooker. 5 more bikers had vanished, each disappearance more inexplicable than the last. One minute they were there, the next, nothing but empty bikes and stripped jackets. The remaining gang members were starting to crack, turning on each other, seeing threats in every shadow. "A Drake's bringing in attack dogs," Tommy reported, his voice carrying the quiet pride of a successful scout. "German shepherds, 6 of them." A smile touched Marcus's lips, the first in days. "Good." "Good?" Tommy's confusion was evident. "Won't they be able to track you?" "Dogs follow scent trails," Marcus explained, checking his watch. "And I just spent 2 hours laying false trails with these." He held up a small vial of liquid, synthetic attractant mixed with industrial chemicals from the port. "By morning, those dogs will be worse than useless." A commotion erupted near the main gate. One of the dogs had caught a scent and was dragging its handler toward a shipping container. Marcus watched with cold satisfaction as the animal led the increasingly frustrated bikers in circles, following carefully planned paths that led nowhere. "You're not just fighting them," Tommy realized, watching the scene unfold. "You're playing with them." "Fear is a weapon," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But confusion is better. Make them doubt everything, their security, their senses, their sanity. That's when they make mistakes." As if to prove his point, a shot rang out across the port. One of the panicked guards had fired at a shadow, nearly hitting his own teammate. The resulting argument drew more men away from their posts, creating another gap in their defense. Tommy's radio, stolen from a careless biker, crackled to life. "All units, movement at the South Pier. Possible intruder. Converge and eliminate." Marcus checked his watch again and nodded. "Right on schedule." "Time for you to go home. But no arguments." His voice carried the snap of command. "Sarah's coming. Back tomorrow to check on her property. She'll need eyes watching her back." The mention of Sarah sobered Tommy immediately. The diner owner had become something of a symbol to the town. Her resilience in the face of destruction, her refusal to be driven out. The boy nodded and began his careful withdrawal, using the routes Marcus had taught him. Once alone, Marcus moved with lethal purpose toward the processing plant. The intruder at the South Pier, triggered by simple timer-activated lights, would draw away crucial security. The dogs would keep others distracted. Now was the time to gather critical intelligence about the weapons lab. He scaled the building's exterior with practiced ease, decades of training making the climb almost effortless. The skylight offered a perfect view of the operation below, and what he saw confirmed his worst fears. The lab wasn't just producing drugs or simple chemical weapons. The equipment, the security measures, the hazmat suits worn by the workers. This was something far more sinister. A noise behind him caused Marcus to melt into the shadows. 2 guards passed on their patrol route. their conversation carrying clearly in the night air. "Drake's losing it, man. These disappearances—" "Shut up! You want to be next? I'm just saying, maybe we should—" Their voices faded, but the fear in their tone was unmistakable. The psychological warfare was working, creating cracks in the gang's unity. But as Marcus watched the weapons lab below, he knew he was running out of time. Whatever the cartel was developing, it was nearly ready for distribution. The sound of approaching motorcycles drew his attention. A group of new arrivals roared through the main gate, fresh reinforcements, heavily armed and moving with military precision. These weren't common bikers. Their movements, their weapons handling, their formation, these were professional mercenaries. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. The gang was escalating, bringing in serious operators. It meant his campaign of fear was working, forcing them to expend resources and expose their connections. But it also meant the real war was about to begin. As if to emphasize the point, one of his carefully placed sensors triggered. Someone was approaching his boat, probably planning to send him a message through destruction. They would find nothing but more fear waiting in the darkness. The hunt would continue tonight, but now the prey was becoming worthy of the predator. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place during a rain-soaked midnight raid on Drake's office. Marcus moved through the darkened processing plant like a ghost, the storm outside masking his movements. Years of experience told him the answers he needed would be here, in the heart of the operation. The office yielded its secrets easily to someone trained in tactical intelligence gathering. Encrypted communications, shipping manifests, chemical formulas, all carefully photographed and memorized. But it was a single photograph that made Marcus's blood run cold. Drake standing next to a familiar face. Viktor Zakharov, the same man who had engineered the ambush in Caracas. "They're calling it Project Poseidon." Robert's voice crackled through Marcus's encrypted radio. "FBI's been tracking it for months. Weaponized chemical agents designed for port deployment contaminate the water supply of entire coastal cities." Marcus studied the technical documents spread across Drake's desk. "These aren't just weapons. They're testing a delivery system, using Port Harbor as a prototype." "It gets worse," Robert continued. "Remember those special meals Sarah caught them distributing? Early-stage trials. They've been using the locals as guinea pigs, monitoring reactions." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Every unexplained illness in town, every case of mysterious symptoms. It hadn't been coincidence. The cartel was perfecting their weapon on innocent civilians. A noise in the corridor outside forced Marcus into the shadows. Two of the new mercenaries passed by, their movements betraying professional military training. Through the cracked door, their conversation drifted in. "Zakharov wants the final testing completed by Friday. Drake's got too personal, too focused. On this vendetta, you saw what happened to Alpha Team. Whoever this guy is, won't matter soon. Once the weapon's ready, this whole port becomes collateral damage." After they passed, Marcus resumed his document search with renewed urgency. The mention of Zakharov's deadline confirmed his fears. They were running out of time. His radio crackled again, this time with Sarah's voice tight with panic. "Marcus, Tommy's missing. He went to check the usual spots but never came back. I've looked everywhere." A muffled scream cut through the night, distant but distinct. Marcus moved to the window, his trained eyes scanning the port. There, near the fuel depot, 3 figures dragging a struggling fourth. "Found him," Marcus transmitted. "Tersely. Sarah, stay where you are. Robert, fuel depot, 5 minutes." He was already moving, years of training taking over as he plotted the most efficient route through the port's maze of containers and warehouses. The rain worked in his favor, reducing visibility and masking sound. But it also meant Tommy had less time. At these temperatures, exposure could be as deadly as any cartel thug. Marcus reached the fuel depot's perimeter in under 3 minutes. 2 guards patrolled the entrance, while voices from inside suggested at least 3 more with Tommy. Through the rain, he could hear Drake's distinctive tone. "Your friend Chen thinks he's being clever, playing his ghost games. But now he learns what happens when you hunt a hunter." Tommy's defiant response carried clearly, "He's going to kill every last one of you." The sound of a blow followed, then Drake again. "Maybe, but first he's going to watch you die, just like he watched his team die in Caracas, slowly, painfully." While the chemicals do their work, Marcus's mind shifted into combat mode, analyzing angles and options. The depot was rigged with security cameras, but the rain provided natural interference. The guards were well armed, but sheltering from the weather, creating blind spots. Most importantly, they weren't watching the roof. The first guard died silently, a precise strike collapsing his windpipe. The second had time to reach for his radio before Marcus's hands snapped his neck with practiced efficiency. Neither body had time to fall before being lowered quietly to the ground. Inside, he could hear Tommy's breathing, ragged but controlled. The boy was scared, but maintaining his composure. Marcus felt a surge of pride even as he plotted his next move. "Sir!" A new voice from inside. "Alpha team's not responding at the main gate." "Because your men are incompetent," Drake snarled. "Radio Zakharov. Tell him we need the extraction moved up and give the boy his first dose. Let's see how our latest batch performs." The sound of a case being opened galvanized Marcus into action. No more stealth, no more psychological warfare. This was about raw speed and violence of action. The skylight shattered under his boots as he descended into the depot like an avenging angel. The first mercenary died before the glass hit the ground, his own knife buried in his throat. The second managed to raise his weapon before Marcus's elbow crushed his larynx. Drake held a syringe to Tommy's neck, using the boy as a shield. One more step, and he gets enough chemical cocktail to liquefy his insides. Marcus went still, calculating. Tommy's eyes met his, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them. The boy's father had been a Marine. He would know what to do. "You know what your problem is, Drake?" Marcus's voice was conversational, almost casual. "You never learned the first rule of combat." "Yeah." Drake's smile was ugly. "What's that?" "Never let your prisoner get their legs free." Tommy's kick caught Drake in the knee, just as Marcus had taught him. As the gang leader stumbled, Marcus closed the distance with lethal grace. The syringe clattered away as Drake reached for a pistol, but he was too slow, too unprepared for the level of violence Marcus had been holding back. The fight was brief and brutal. Drake had street-fighting skills and cruel instincts, but he was facing a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of close-quarter combat. When it ended, Drake lay broken on the floor, barely conscious. "You okay?" Marcus asked Tommy, checking him for injuries. The boy nodded, though he was shaking. They were going to use me to test their weapon, like they've been testing it on everyone else." "I know." Marcus secured Drake with zip ties, his movements precise despite the rage burning in his chest. "But now we have proof, and a direct link to Zakharov." Police sirens wailed in the distance, Robert's response team arriving, but Marcus's attention was on the chemical case the mercenaries had brought. Inside lay the evidence they needed, detailed formulas, testing protocols, and most importantly, the timeline for Project Poseidon's full deployment. The rain continued to pour outside, washing away traces of violence. But for Marcus, the storm was just beginning. Zakharov, the man ultimately responsible for his team's death in Caracas, was coming to Port Harbor. This time Marcus would be ready. The interrogation room at Port Harbor's police station smelled of copper and fear. Drake sat handcuffed to a steel table, his face a mess of bruises from his encounter with Marcus. But despite his injuries, he wore a smile that suggested he still held cards to play. "You think you've won something here?" Drake's voice was raspy, but carried an edge of dark amusement. You have no idea what's really going on, do you, Commander Chen? Marcus stood in the shadows, letting Robert handle the official questioning. But at Drake's words, something tugged at his memory. Something about the way Drake said, "Commander," like it was a private joke. "Where's Zakharov?" Robert demanded, spreading surveillance photos across the table. Drake's laugh turned into a wet cough. "Zakharov? He's just middle management. A face for you to chase. The real power." He looked directly at Marcus. "Well, some ghosts don't stay buried, do they, Tide?" The nickname hit Marcus like a physical blow. Only his SEAL team had used that call sign. Even the official mission reports had listed him by his operational designation. "How do you know that—" "Name?" Marcus stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "Caracas wasn't an ambush." Drake's smile widened, showing blood-stained teeth. "It was a test run, and you passed with flying colors, just like the brass predicted. One man surviving against impossible odds, taking down an entire cartel operation. Perfect proof of concept." The implication slammed into Marcus like a tidal wave. "Operation Kingfish," he breathed. "It wasn't a counter-narcotics mission." "Finally," Drake sneered. "The great Commander Chen catches up. Your team wasn't ambushed by the cartel. They were sacrificed by your own government. A field test for Project Poseidon's prototype. And you—" He laughed again. "You were the control group." Robert's hand went to his sidearm as Marcus moved with lethal intent toward Drake. But the former SEAL stopped just short of violence, his mind racing through years of memories, seeing them in a horrifying new light. "The delayed extraction," Marcus said quietly. "The compromised communications, the intelligence failure that put us in that kill box. It was all planned. A rogue military division working with certain cartel elements," Drake confirmed. "Testing chemical weapons, creating the perfect soldier through controlled exposure. Your team died, but you demonstrated remarkable resistance to the compound. Made yourself very interesting to some very powerful people." Marcus's training was the only thing keeping him from snapping Drake's neck. "You were there. Remote observation team." Drake's eyes took on a distant look. "Watching through thermal imaging as your men died. Taking notes on transmission vectors, survival rates, physical responses. Beautiful data, really. And now—" His smile returned. "Now we're ready for full deployment. Zakharov's just the delivery boy. The real operation makes Caracas look like a practice run." A commotion outside the interrogation room drew their attention. Officer Jenkins burst in, his face pale. "Chief, multiple vehicles entering town, military grade, and we just lost contact with the harbor patrol." Robert swore, reaching for his radio, but Marcus was already moving, his mind shifting from the horror of revelation to tactical response. "How many?" 3 SUVs, 2 transport trucks, professional. Operators, heavy weapons. Not cartel thugs, Marcus concluded. Special Activities Division. Here to clean up their operation. He turned to Robert. "Get Sarah and Tommy to the backup safe house, now." "Running won't save them," Drake called out as they headed for the door. "The same people who sanctioned Caracas. They own this whole coastline. There's nowhere you can hide." Marcus paused in the doorway. "Who said anything about running?" He left Drake chuckling darkly and moved with purpose through the station. His mind was already cataloguing resources, planning contingencies. The betrayal burned in his chest, but he forced the emotion down. Rage was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. "My God," Robert said as they reached his office. "If what he's saying is true, a rogue military division working with cartels, testing weapons on U.S. soil. Makes sense," Marcus replied, checking his watch. "Private military contractors, black budget operations, deniable assets, perfect cover for illegal weapons development." He picked up Robert's secure phone. "Time to call in some favors. Your old SEAL contacts. Better. Marcus dialed a number from memory. Remember Rodriguez, that CIA wet work specialist we worked with in Panama? He owes me for that business in Bogota, and he's been tracking Project Poseidon for months. Robert's eyes widened. The CIA knows about this? Certain elements, the ones who still believe in right and wrong. Marcus spoke rapidly into the phone in fluent Spanish, then hung up. We have 2 hours before the cleanup crew starts their sweep. Rodriguez is activating his team, but they won't get here in time to prevent the initial assault. Through the station windows, they could see the first SUVs rolling into town. Black vehicles with darkened windows, moving with military precision, professional killers coming to tie up loose ends. What's the play? Robert asked, falling naturally into his old role as Marcus's second in command. They'll expect us to run, or hide. Marcus checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. So we do neither. We take the fight to them, turn Port Harbor into a killing ground. Just like old times. There was a hint of their younger selves in Robert's grim smile. No, Marcus replied, thinking of Sarah and Tommy, of his dead team in Caracas, of all the innocent lives ruined by powerful men playing their deadly games. This time we're not following orders. This time we're fighting for something that matters. The first explosions rocked the harbor as the cleanup crew began their operation. But Marcus Chen was already moving, his mind clear, his purpose set. He had been betrayed by his own government, had watched his team die as test subjects, had spent years running from the truth. Now it was time to stop running, time to become the tide once again and wash away everything in his path. Port Harbor transformed into a war zone in less than an hour. Marcus moved with ruthless efficiency, turning the familiar landscape into a deadly maze of traps and ambush points. Every skill he'd learned in 25 years of special operations, every lesson paid for in blood, now served a single purpose: survival. They've set up checkpoints at both highway entrances, Robert reported through their secure channel. Professional three-man teams, overlapping fields of fire. These aren't cartel thugs. They're running military-grade equipment and tactical formations. Marcus continued rigging the fuel line beneath Pier 7, his hands moving with practiced precision. Expected. They'll establish a perimeter first, then sweep inward. Standard killbox protocol. He checked his watch. How long until Sarah and Tommy reach the safe house? Problem. Robert's voice tightened. Tommy slipped away from the escort, left a note saying he had vital information about the weapons lab. Said he had to retrieve something. Marcus suppressed a curse. The boy was brave, but didn't understand the level of danger they were facing. These cleanup crews wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a teenager who knew too much. A distant explosion rocked the harbor, the strike teams beginning their systematic destruction of evidence. Soon, they'd reach the processing plant, erasing all trace of Project Poseidon's testing program. Northwest cargo area is prepped, Marcus transmitted, moving to his next position. Remote detonators set. When they trigger the pressure plates, the containers will create a bottleneck. Like Manila? Robert asked, referring to a joint operation from their past. Similar, but this time we're using their own tactics against them. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. They'll expect us to run for the highways. Instead, we're forcing them onto the water. The harbor's layout was perfect for his strategy. Years of watching tide patterns, current flows, and vessel movements had taught him every blind spot and choke point. The cleanup crew's military precision would become a weakness, their orthodox tactics predictable in this unorthodox battlefield. His radio crackled with a new voice. Tommy, breathing hard. Mr. Chen? I got it. The evidence from the lab, hidden. Camera footage of the weapons tests, documentation of the military connection, it's all here. Where are you? Marcus demanded, already moving. Storage shed by the old cannery. But they're coming. I can hear them. The transmission cut off as gunfire erupted in the distance. Marcus broke into a controlled sprint, his mind calculating angles and approaches. The cannery was exposed, overlooked by multiple sniper positions. Getting to Tommy would require drawing fire. "Robert, I need a distraction. Something big. On it." A moment later, the night lit up as the fuel depot at the port's south end erupted in flames. The explosion would pull attention and resources, but not for long. Marcus reached the cannery's perimeter just as two tactical teams converged on Tommy's position. Through his scope, he counted 6 operators, former special forces by their movement patterns, armed with suppressed MP5s and night vision gear. The boy had wedged himself into a drainage culvert, using its concrete walls as cover. Smart, but not sustainable. The teams were maneuvering to flush him out with grenades. Time slowed as Marcus's combat instincts took over. The first shot took the team leader through the throat, a silent kill that created crucial seconds of confusion. His second and third rounds found gaps in body armor, dropping 2 more operators before they identified his position. Return fire chewed into the shipping container beside him as Marcus rolled to a new vantage point. The remaining operators split up, attempting to flank his position, but they were operating on military doctrine, expecting conventional responses. Marcus was anything but conventional. He triggered the first of his prepared charges, collapsing a stack of containers that crushed one operator and separated the other 2. His fourth shot caught a man transitioning between cover positions. The last operator managed to call for backup before Marcus's thrown combat knife found his carotid artery. "Tommy, move! Now!" The boy sprinted from the culvert, clutching a waterproof bag to his chest. Marcus covered his retreat, scanning for the reinforcements he knew would be coming. They had maybe 2 minutes before the area was swarming with cleanup teams. "Did you get what you needed?" Marcus asked as they reached temporary safety behind the harbor master's office. Tommy nodded, still catching his breath. "Everything. They were recording the tests, documenting reactions, people we know, our neighbors." His voice cracked. "They were just experiment subjects." Marcus checked his ammunition, mind already plotting their next move. "That evidence needs to reach Rodriguez's CIA team. It's the only way to expose the whole operation." More explosions lit up the port as the cleanup crews continued their systematic destruction. Soon they'd control the entire harbor, eliminating witnesses and evidence with professional efficiency. But Marcus had spent 5 years learning every inch of this port, mapping its secrets, understanding its rhythms. Now, as gun battles erupted, across the waterfront and helicopters appeared on the horizon, he allowed himself a predatory smile. The tide was rising, and with it came the hunt. The attack began at midnight, announced by the whomp-whomp of helicopter rotors and the screech of tires on wet pavement. Marcus watched from the shadows as 3 black SUVs disgorged tactical teams into the harbor, their movements precise and coordinated. These were the elite cleaners, sent to ensure nothing remained of Project Poseidon. 4-man teams, standard clear and sweep formation, Marcus transmitted to Robert. Night vision equipment, breaching charges. They're not trying to be subtle anymore. Multiple contacts approaching the police station, Robert replied, his voice tight with tension. They're getting bold, moving in official vehicles with government plates. Marcus checked his improvised command center, a forgotten maintenance shed with clear sight lines of the harbor's main approaches. The security cameras he'd tapped into showed the cleanup crew's methodical advance. They think their cover makes them untouchable. Time to change that perception. He keyed his radio again. "Tommy, are you in position?" "Yes, sir." The boy's voice was steady despite the danger. "Sarah's helping coordinate the local resistance. Everyone's ready." The first phase began as the tactical teams reached Marcus's outer perimeter. Pressure plates hidden beneath innocent-looking debris triggered a cascade of explosions, sending shipping containers crashing down to block escape routes. The professionals immediately shifted to contingency protocols, but Marcus had planned for that too. "Now," he commanded. Across the harbor, lights blazed to life, powerful work lamps strategically positioned to destroy the tactical team's night vision advantage. In the same instant, Robert's police officers opened fire from multiple elevations, using their knowledge of local architecture to create devastating crossfire zones. The cleanup crews responded with military precision, attempting to establish counter-sniper positions. But 5 years of fishing hadn't dulled Marcus's tactical instincts. Every obvious vantage point was already rigged with remote detonated charges. Secondary explosions rocked the port as Marcus's traps claimed their victims. The professional killers found themselves caught in a nightmare of their own doctrine, every standard response leading them deeper into prepared kill zones. "They're adapting," Robert warned, "breaking into smaller units, abandoning conventional tactics." Good. Marcus moved from his position, rifle ready. Means they're getting desperate, switching to close-quarters elimination. The next phase of battle transformed Port Harbor's familiar landscape into a maze of death. Marcus moved like a ghost through the shadows, employing every close combat skill learned in decades of special operations. The cleanup crews were elite operators, but they were fighting on his turf now. A 3-man team swept past his position, checking corners with professional thoroughness. Marcus let them pass before striking. His first knife throw caught the rear guard in the base of the skull. Before the body hit the ground, he was moving. The second man died from a crushed larynx, never seeing his attacker. The team leader managed to bring his weapon to bear, but Marcus was already inside his guard. A precise strike to the temple, followed by a savage knee to the solar plexus, ended the threat. Multiple tangos approaching the evidence lockup, Tommy reported through the radio. "They're using some kind of chemical agent. Gas masks." Marcus's blood ran cold. "They're deploying Poseidon. Robert, get your people back. Full containment protocols." The night air filled with the hiss of aerosol dispersal units. The cleanup crews were releasing the weapon, trying to flush out resistance through chemical warfare. But Marcus had prepared for this too. "Activate Harbor Protocol 7, he commanded. Across the port, emergency fire suppression systems roared to life. Industrial-grade sprinklers created a curtain of water, diluting the chemical agent before it could reach lethal concentration. The cleanup crews found their weapon turned against them as the water drove the chemicals back into their own positions. "CIA teams 15 minutes out," Robert transmitted. "Just need to hold them a little longer." Marcus moved through the chaos like an avenging spirit, exploiting the confusion his traps had created. Each encounter was brief and lethal. A knife in the dark, a precise shot, a broken neck. The professional killers found themselves hunted by something that ignored their tactical doctrine and struck from impossible angles. Near the processing plant, he encountered heavier resistance. A full tactical squad had established a defensive position, laying down suppressing fire while they rigged demolition charges. They were trying to destroy the remaining evidence of Project Poseidon. "Tommy, initiate Harbor Defense Protocol 3. The boys' response was immediate. Port Harbor's industrial fire doors slammed down, isolating sections of the facility. The tactical squad found themselves trapped in their own kill zone, cut off from support. What followed was a masterclass in close-quarters combat. Marcus moved through the shadows with deadly grace, using years of SEAL training to eliminate threats with terrifying efficiency. Bodies fell in silence, professional operators dying without ever seeing their killer. But the cleanup crews had one final card to play. A familiar voice crackled over their tactical frequency. Zakharov himself, speaking from a command position outside the harbor. "Chemical deployment authorized. Full saturation. Burn it all." The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder as gunships appeared over the port, carrying industrial dispersal units. They were going to poison the entire harbor, eliminating all evidence and witnesses in one devastating strike. Marcus keyed his radio. All units. Final positions. Endgame protocols. Active. The real battle for Port Harbor was about to begin. The gunship's rotors churned the harbor waters into a froth as they moved into position for chemical deployment. Marcus watched them through his scope, timing their approach patterns. 5 years of observing weather conditions and wind patterns over Port Harbor were about to pay off. They're setting up a dispersal grid, he transmitted to Robert. Standard military pattern for maximum coverage, but they don't know about the harbor's thermal updrafts. The night winds, Robert confirmed, understanding immediately, like we used to see in the Gulf. Exactly. When the cold water meets warm, air... Marcus checked his watch. 3 minutes until the temperature differential peaks. Tommy, status. The boy's voice came through clearly despite the chaos. Evidence is secured in the underwater cache, just like you showed me. Sarah's leading the last civilians through the tunnel system. Marcus allowed himself a moment of pride. The boy had learned well. The hidden tunnels, remnants of Prohibition-era smuggling routes, now served as escape paths for Port Harbor's residents. The first gunship began its chemical deployment run, released a cloud of deadly vapor. But Marcus had spent years studying the harbor's air currents. The thermal updraft caught the chemical cloud, sending it spiraling back toward the aircraft. Pilots scrambled to clear the contaminated air, their precise formation dissolving. Now, Marcus commanded. Across the harbor, focused charges detonated at key structural points. Cargo cranes toppled with mathematical precision, their cables whipping through the air like steel snakes. One helicopter pilot tried to evade, but Marcus had calculated the angles perfectly. Cables entangled the rotor, sending the gunship crashing into the processing plant. The remaining aircraft retreated, trying to establish a new attack pattern. But Marcus was already moving to his next position, targeting the ground forces attempting to breach the harbor's inner perimeter. Multiple threats approaching the evidence lockup, Tommy reported. They've got some kind of... Wait. His voice. Caught. Mr. Chen, it's Drake. He's loose, and he's leading them right to the tunnel entrance. Marcus's mind raced through options. The tunnels were the civilians' only escape route, if Drake's men sealed them off. Tommy, implement Protocol Echo. Get that evidence to the rendezvous point. I'll handle Drake. But move, now. The cleanup crews had breached the outer defenses, but that was part of Marcus's plan. Like the tide itself, he was drawing them, deeper into his killing ground. Each step they took led them further into pre-prepared firing positions and overlapping fields of fire. He encountered the first team near the fuel tanks, 4 operators moving with professional precision. But they were trained for urban warfare, not the unique environment of a working harbor. Marcus used the maze of pipes and industrial equipment to separate them, picking them off one by one. The 4th man managed to radio a warning before Marcus's knife found his throat, but by then it didn't matter. The trap was already sprung. Remote. Charges detonated beneath the fuel tanks, not to explode them, but to rupture specific lines. Burning fuel poured into carefully dug channels, creating rivers of fire that divided the harbor into controlled sectors. The cleanup crews found themselves cut off from support, trapped in killing zones of Marcus's design. CIA team reports 5 minutes out, Robert transmitted. But we've got a problem. Drake's men are using some kind of specialized breaching charges on the tunnel gates. Marcus moved faster, eliminating threats with cold efficiency. Each encounter was brief and lethal, a shadow in the darkness, a silent shot, a broken neck. The professional killers found themselves hunted by something that ignored their tactical doctrine and struck from impossible angles. He reached the tunnel entrance just as Drake's team was setting their charges. Tommy had sealed the main gates, but they wouldn't hold long against military-grade explosives. "Bring it down," Drake shouted, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. "Bury them all." Marcus triggered his final set of charges, not to kill, but to flood. Predetermined rupture points in the harbor's water mains sent torrents crashing through the area. Drake's men, focused on their breaching attempt, never saw the wave coming. The rush of water swept them off their feet, sending them tumbling. Marcus moved through the chaos like a force of nature, ending threats with surgical precision. Years of underwater demolition training made him lethal in these conditions, but Drake had anticipated this move. As Marcus eliminated the last of his men, the gang leader appeared on a higher platform, an M32 grenade launcher raised. "You think you're so clever," Drake snarled, "playing with your little traps and tricks. But I was there in Caracas. I watched your team die." "No," Marcus replied calmly, already moving. "You watched from safety, through cameras, like a coward." Drake's first shot went wide, the grenade exploding against a cargo container. His second and third bracketed Marcus's position, but the former, Seal, was never where the explosions landed. Like water itself, he flowed through the battlefield. "You don't understand," Drake shouted, his composure cracking. "Project Poseidon isn't just about weapons. It's about evolution, creating the perfect soldier through controlled exposure." "I understand perfectly." Marcus's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You murdered innocent people. Used my team as lab rats, and now—" The last word was whispered directly behind Drake. The gang leader spun, but too late. Marcus's strike shattered his elbow, sending the grenade launcher spinning away. What followed was a brutal lesson in close-quarter combat. Drake fought with desperate strength, but he was facing a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of killing. When it ended, he lay broken on the platform, blood mixing with the water. Around him, the CIA, Drake coughed. "They'll never let you expose this. Too many powerful people involved." "That's where you're wrong." Marcus zip-tied the gang leader's hands. "Tommy's already delivered the evidence. Every test, every murder, every connection, it's all going public." Through his radio, he heard the distinctive sound of CIA helicopters approaching. Rodriguez's team had arrived, bringing with them the authority to expose Project Poseidon to the world. The battle for Port Harbor was nearly over. But Marcus knew the real war. The fight to reveal the truth about Caracas, about the weapons tests, about everything was just beginning. Dawn was breaking over Port Harbor, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of blood red. Marcus stood at the edge of Pier 7, watching as CIA helicopters evacuated the last civilians. Behind him, Drake knelt in handcuffs, surrounded by Rodriguez's tactical team. "You still don't remember me, do you?" Drake's voice carried across the burning waterfront. "Caracas wasn't the first time we met, Commander Chen." Marcus turned slowly, studying the beaten man before him. There was something familiar in those eyes, something that tugged at memories he'd tried to bury. "Baghdad," Drake said softly. "Operation Sandstorm, 2003. You were leading a joint special operations task force." His laugh turned into a wet cough. "I was one of your assets." The memories hit Marcus like physical blows. A younger Drake, without the scars, working as their local intelligence liaison. "You were CIA back then, codenamed Jackal, the agency's favorite chemical weapons expert." Drake's smile was bitter. "Until your team's mission exposed my side projects. Testing experimental. Compounds on insurgents, studying reaction patterns. Sound familiar?" Marcus's hands clenched into fists. "You disappeared before we could arrest you." "Disappeared?" "No, Commander. I was recruited. Project Poseidon needed someone who understood both military operations and chemical warfare. Someone willing to push boundaries." Rodriguez approached, his CIA tactical team securing the area. "We found the complete files in his command center. Everything about Caracas, about the weapons testing here in Port Harbor. Names, dates, authorization codes." But Marcus barely heard him. His focus was entirely on Drake, on the revelation that was turning his world inside out. You set up the Caracas ambush, used your old CIA contacts to feed us false intelligence. Your team's resistance to the prototype compound was remarkable, Drake said, sounding almost admiring. Well, except for Johnson. Poor kid never had a chance, but you were something special. The way you fought through the effects, adapted to the toxin. You proved the whole concept could work. Marcus moved with explosive speed, grabbing Drake by the throat. Rodriguez's team raised their weapons but didn't interfere. They'd all read the files, understood what this man had done. All those people, Marcus growled. My team, Tommy's father, the Port Harbor civilians. They were just test subjects to you. They were stepping stones. Drake's eyes blazed with fanatical intensity. Don't you see? We're creating the next stage of warfare. Soldiers who can adapt to any chemical agent, who become stronger through exposure. Your survival in Caracas proved it was possible. The sound of more helicopters approaching drew their attention. These weren't CIA aircraft. They bore military markings, the kind used by the shadowy government division behind Project Poseidon. Clean up. A team, Rodriguez warned. They'll try to contain the situation, bury the evidence. Marcus released Drake, his mind already shifting to tactical considerations. But the gang leader wasn't finished. You can't stop it, he wheezed. Project Poseidon has support at the highest levels. They'll deny everything, discredit your evidence, eliminate witnesses. No. Marcus's voice was cold as Arctic water. Because you're going to tell them everything, Drake laughed. You think I'll confess? Turn on my own people? I think, Marcus said quietly, that the compound you've been testing has some interesting side effects. Terminal ones. And I think you've been exposing yourself to it for years, studying the results. The color drained from Drake's face. How? Did you? Your hands shake when you think no one's watching. Your pupils don't dilate properly, classic signs of neurological degradation. Marcus leaned closer. You're dying, Drake. Your own weapon is killing you. How long do you have? 6 months less. Rodriguez understood immediately. We can get you treatment, experimental programs, medical support, but only if you cooperate. Otherwise, Marcus finished, you die painfully in a black site somewhere. Your existence erased, just like you erased my team. The military helicopters were getting closer. Drake looked from them to Marcus, his arrogance crumbling as the reality of his situation sank in. I'll need protection, he said finally. Insurance against retaliation. You'll get it, Rodriguez promised. But first, we need everything. Every name, every connection, every detail about Caracas and Port Harbor. Drake nodded slowly. Defeat, evident in his posture. But as the CIA team moved to evacuate him, he looked at Marcus one last time. You know why I really chose this port? His voice was barely a whisper. Because I needed to understand. How did you survive when everyone else died? What made you different? He shook his head. But I was asking the wrong question. It was never about the chemical resistance. It was about what drives a man to keep fighting when everything is lost. Marcus watched as they led Drake away, his mind wrestling with the implications of everything he'd learned. The betrayal went deeper than he'd imagined, reached higher than he'd suspected. But at least now he had answers. About Caracas, about his team, about the nightmares that had haunted him for years. We need to move, Rodriguez urged. Once that military team lands... Let them come, Marcus replied, checking his weapons. They want to bury the truth about Project Poseidon? His smile was predatory. They'll have to bury me first. The sun rose higher over Port Harbor, its light revealing the destruction of the night's battle. But for Marcus Chen, the new day brought something he'd thought lost forever. Clarity of purpose. The tide of war had revealed its secrets, and now it was time for justice to flow. The military helicopters never landed. One phone call from Rodriguez to his CIA superiors had been enough to turn them back. Marcus watched them retreat into the distance, carrying with them the last threat to Port Harbor's safety. But the damage was already done. Smoke still rose from multiple buildings, and the morning light revealed the full extent of the night's violence. The processing plant was a burned-out shell, the fuel depot a blackened crater, bullet holes riddled warehouses, and blood stained the weathered wood of the piers. 7 dead, Robert reported, joining Marcus at the water's edge. All clean up, crew members, no civilian casualties. He paused, letting that sink in. You did it, Marcus. You protected them. But Marcus was looking at his reflection in the harbor waters, seeing the warrior he'd become again. His hands, now cleaned of gunpowder residue, still felt heavy with violence. At what cost? Sarah approached, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes clear. At the cost of stopping them. The evidence Tommy recovered. It's already being broadcast. Project Poseidon can't hide anymore. As if to confirm her words, distant sirens announced the arrival of federal agencies. The CIA had kept the military at bay, but now the FBI, DEA, and other legitimate authorities were converging on Port Harbor. The truth would be impossible to contain. Drake's talking, Rodriguez added, walking up to their group. Names, dates, locations, everything about the weapons program. Turns out imminent death is quite the motivator for cooperation. He handed Marcus a thick file, including the full truth about Caracas. Marcus took the file but didn't open it. He already knew what it contained, the official confirmation of his team's betrayal, the documentation of their sacrifice as test subjects, knowledge he'd fought for but now wasn't sure he wanted. They'll try to bury it, Robert warned. Too many powerful people involved. Let them try. Sarah's voice carried steel beneath its gentleness. We've got copies of everything, multiple. News agencies, social media. The truth isn't just in one place anymore. Tommy appeared, looking exhausted but proud. The boy had shown remarkable courage throughout the night, helping coordinate the civilian evacuation while keeping the evidence secure. Now he stood straighter, as if the weight of his father's death had somehow lightened. The harbor's going to need rebuilding, he said, looking at the destruction around them. But we can make it better, stronger. Marcus studied the young man before him, seeing not just Tommy's growth, but a reflection of his own journey. The violence had been necessary, but it wasn't the end of the story. What mattered was what came after. Rodriguez, he turned to the CIA operative. The weapons lab data, the test results. Can your people use it to help the victims? Find treatments for those exposed? The agent nodded. Already in motion. We've got medical teams standing by, specialists ready to begin treatment protocols. Drake's cooperation will accelerate the process. Sarah touched Marcus's arm gently. You're not alone anymore. Whatever comes next, we face it together. He looked around at the gathering crowd. Port workers returning, residents emerging from safety, federal agents beginning their investigation. The truth about Project Poseidon would shake institutions and topple powerful figures. But here, in this moment, he saw something more important. Community. I made a promise, he said quietly, thinking of Maria. To find peace. Maybe, Robert suggested, peace isn't about avoiding violence. Maybe it's about knowing when to fight and what to fight for. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of smoke. Port Harbor was wounded but not broken. Like Marcus himself, it had weathered a storm and emerged changed but undefeated. We rebuild, he decided, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded elite warriors, but now spoke of healing. Not just the buildings, everything. The tide was turning, carrying away the night's violence. But unlike before, Marcus Chen wasn't hiding from what he was. The warrior and the fisherman had found their balance, just as Port Harbor would find its way forward. The war was over. The healing could begin. 3 months after the Battle of Port Harbor, Sarah's diner reopened. Not just a temporary stand this time, but a proper restaurant built with community support and federal reconstruction funds. Marcus sat at his usual spot by the window, drinking his morning coffee, watching the harbor come alive with honest work once again. The evidence Tommy recovered had done more than expose Project Poseidon. It had brought healing. Medical teams had developed treatments for those exposed to the chemical agents, and rehabilitation programs were showing promising results. The truth had set more than secrets free. "Same as usual?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer, but now their morning ritual carried new meaning. Each normal moment was a victory, a step further from the violence that had nearly destroyed their home. "The fishing fleet's back to full strength," Tommy reported, sliding into the seat across from Marcus. The boy, young man now, had taken on a leadership role in the port's reconstruction. Even got some new crews coming in, words spreading that Port Harbor's a good place to work again. Marcus nodded, noting the changes in Tommy's bearing. The trauma of that night hadn't broken him. It had forged him into something stronger. Like father, like son, both warriors in their own way. Through the window, he could see Robert directing traffic around new construction. The police chief had received a commendation for his role in exposing the conspiracy, but he seemed more proud of the community policing program he'd established. Trust was being rebuilt, one day at a time. "Got a letter from Rodriguez," Tommy continued, his voice careful. "They're making progress with the prosecutions. Drake's testimony. It goes higher than anyone expected. Military officials, government contractors, even some senators implicated." "Justice takes time," Marcus replied. Though the weight of Caracas felt lighter now, his team hadn't died for nothing. Their sacrifice had ultimately exposed a corruption that might have poisoned the entire nation. The diner's door chimed as more morning regulars arrived. Port Harbor was changing, growing. The reconstruction had brought new businesses, new families. The shadow of fear had been replaced by the light of opportunity. "You know what today is?" Sarah asked softly, refilling Marcus's cup. He did. 1 year ago exactly, he'd made a promise on Maria's grave to find peace. Back then, he'd thought peace meant hiding from his warrior nature. Now he understood. True peace came from finding the right battles, from protecting instead of just surviving. "The harbor needs you," Tommy said, reading his thoughts. "Not just your skills or your strength, your example. You showed us how to face darkness without losing ourselves." Marcus looked out at the water, at the fishermen preparing their boats for the day's work. He'd found more than peace here. He'd found purpose, community, family. The warrior and the fisherman weren't separate beings anymore. They were parts of a whole, balanced like the tide itself. "We all need each other," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet wisdom of hard-won experience. "That's what makes a harbor safe. Not walls or weapons, people watching out for each other." Sarah smiled, understanding in her eyes. "Speaking of which, the community center opens next week. The one you helped design? They want you to teach some classes, self-defense, maritime skills, whatever you think people need to know. The idea of passing on knowledge, of turning combat skills into tools for protection rather than destruction, felt right. Another way to balance the scales between warrior and peacetime man. "Time to head out," Tommy said, rising. "Got a new crew to train. Still want to check their background profiles?" Marcus nodded, hiding a smile. Old habits died hard, but now they served a different purpose. Vigilance without paranoia. Strength without aggression. The lessons of war applied to keeping peace. The morning sun painted Port Harbor in shades of promise. There would always be threats, always be battles worth fighting. But now Marcus Chen knew his true mission. Not just to defend this place, but to help it thrive. He had found his harbor. And, this time, the tide brought hope. The evening tide rolled into Port Harbor, gentle waves lapping against the restored piers. Marcus Chen stood at the edge of his favorite fishing spot, watching the sun paint the horizon in brilliant oranges and purples. His boat, freshly maintained and ready for tomorrow's work, bobbed peacefully beside him. The port had risen from its ashes, transformed but unbroken. Where once there had been corruption and fear, now there was community and strength. The processing plant had been converted into a maritime training center, its dark history replaced by a promise of future opportunity. Marcus touched the weathered dog tags hanging around his neck, a reminder of his fallen team, of Caracas, of battles fought and lessons learned. But now these memories brought something besides pain. They brought purpose. Every class he taught at the community center, every skill he passed on to the new generation of port workers, honored their sacrifice. Tommy and Sarah emerged from the diner carrying dinner to share by the water's edge. This had become their tradition, a moment of peace at day's end, watching the harbor settle into its nighttime rhythm. They were more than friends now. They were family, forged in fire and tempered by shared resilience. The tide would always turn, bringing new challenges to Port Harbor's shores, but Marcus Chen had finally found his balance, not running from his warrior past, but using it to protect the peace he'd helped create. In these calm waters, he had discovered that sometimes the greatest battles are won not through force, but through the courage to begin again. The sun set on Port Harbor, and Marcus Chen, former SEAL, fisherman and guardian, allowed himself to smile. He was home.